Okay, so we now have with us Lawrence Berlin, who is the Academic Director of Idiomas at EAFIT. So welcome, Lawrence.
Thank you, Inés. Good morning. Those of you who are coming to the presentation, I see that we have a big mess on the screen, so I'm just going to move to the presentation and begin, as I know we have limited time. All right, so this presentation is part of a project that we've been engaged in for the past 2 years, and we'll be focusing today on authentic assessment and the way we've constructed it for the presentation of our new curriculum. My co-presenters, or I should say my co-researchers, Juan Felipe Zuluaga, is not able to be with me today, nor Ana Patricia Munoz, but all of them were very heavily involved in this project from the very beginning, and they specifically were focused on the assessment component. So I'll just jump ahead and give you a brief overview of what the agenda is for the presentation. We'll present an objective for this particular presentation today, a little bit of the background that will give you some context for how we arrived at this particular moment, presenting a little bit of the pillars of the curricular framework, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, so I won't go into too much detail there and bore you. We'll then move on to the pillars of the evaluative framework as we have elaborated it related to the curricular change, and then just talk a little bit about some of the choices that we made which emerged during the process of the curricular renovation, and then I'll give you a brief recap and some conclusions. Okay, so jumping in. The purpose of the presentation today is to report on a particular model of assessment which emerged from the curricular renovation process, which we began during the early part of 2019. This was done in our language center, Idiomas, in EAFIT, which is a private university in Medellin, Antioquia. It resulted from a particular case study which we conducted and led to the identification of a participatory approach in response to the belief system of our stakeholders, including our students, as well as the academic team and our teachers. And then again, one of the things that we learned was that the institution itself has gone through a transformation of sorts. And so this particular curricular renovation was right in line with that particular movement towards looking for some sort of innovation and ensuring that we were responding to the needs of our students, both current and future. I'll just read this piece briefly. So engaging in curricular renovation is not a singular activity. Obviously, it's a very large project, and changes to curricular designs and plans, as well as the pedagogical component which accompanies their delivery, don't exist outside of the assessment component, as you all know. So restructuring the evaluation system, both in terms of student proficiency as well as teacher efficacy, led to the integration of more authentic assessment in the context of the participatory approach which we had selected. Okay, just to give you a brief background, which I've already mentioned, at the time when I arrived in late 2018, I was charged with conducting some review of the entire curriculum to determine how we could improve it. And so at that time, we undertook a case study. The different components of the case study involved looking at documentation that already existed. The institutional education plan obviously was relevant to that, as well as individual syllabi and lesson plans. I should also give you a brief context, which you'll forgive me for skipping. Our particular language institute is situated within the university EAFIT in Medellin, as I mentioned. However, our student population, which is roughly around 10,000 students per year, consists of about 35% of the actual students of the university. We offer 8 different languages to a variety of populations, including adults, some of them the student population, as well as external adults who are interested in studying language. We also serve an adolescent community, which is comprised of many of the high schools in the area, and we also have a program for children. Okay, so basically the context. Again, so we looked over the individual lesson plans and the syllabi. We also had survey results available to us from a survey that had been conducted in 2018, which consisted of approximately 2,000 participants. And there had been also information from an earlier external survey, which had been conducted by Communications and Marketing of the university itself. We also had interviews with the academic team members individually, as well as a variety of the teachers in our various programs and a series of students. And then, of course, there were classroom observations, and we also had focus groups, which were part of this. All of these combined together to identify for us that a participatory approach under the umbrella of a communicative approach was the type of method that we would be employing at the university. And of course, here you can see a little bit of the critical literacy foundations that informed the way that we approached this task. Also considering the type of orientation of students at this particular moment, it was necessary for us to consider how, you know, in sort of like the change of time, the orientation of students towards learning in general and language learning specifically has taken on a much more socio-critical aspect, because now students question what is the need, what is the purpose, and that was also part of the decision that we took in terms of identifying how we would move forward with the methodology. And as you've seen in other presentations during this conference, and you're already familiar with, the curricular framework that we're considering, what I refer to as the curriculum with a capital C, involves the written curriculum and the different aspects that are part of the decisions made for how we present the curriculum. Also, pedagogy is involved, and the reason we're here in this conference, what we're most predominantly focused on, obviously, is the evaluation component. And as I mentioned, and you can see here on the screen in this particular slide, these are the different populations that we serve through our language program. So now, moving on specifically to the pillars of the evaluative framework, I have my notes from my colleague who was going to prepare this piece. So I'll be talking a little bit about it, but also referring to the message that he wanted to share with you. So in this particular framework, what you can see is the aspect of authentic evaluation, which aligned itself with the curricular renovation and the way that we were approaching this particular task of the curricular renovation. We defined these three aspects as components that were necessary as we were working on this evolving framework, and those were looking at outcomes, looking at our purposes in particular, and of course, looking at the various criteria that we would be looking at in terms of the actual what are we assessing. So in terms of the outcomes, clearly we wanted to be able to have a process of evaluation that also incorporated meaningful washback for our students. We wanted to conceptualize assessment in terms of its formative nature as aligned with the concept of learning. So obviously we all understand that there are moments when you have to sort of stop the learning process and take a snapshot of how students are progressing, but obviously the focus on the assessment in the transcurso, in the course of events at the institute, as well as the language courses, we wanted to maintain the focus on process more than product, so that students looked at their particular assessment as part of their regular learning process. In terms of the purposes, we wanted to move beyond just purely communicative situations. We have this motto at the university, which is transforming lives. And so trying to think about how that could be potentially operationalized into a curricular framework and a way of learning, we also wanted to consider how that could be, in fact, a destination of what we were attempting to achieve, even within a language curriculum. And in terms of the criteria, considering in particular the two different aspects, the productive skills, we identified three aspects: achievement, critical engagement, and precision. And in terms of the receptive skills, we were looking at both literal as well as inferential, and trying to add the feature of critical in terms of the comprehension. Okay, so in terms of the productive criteria, we went ahead and we designed rubrics. We needed to look at various aspects. These aspects essentially were student achievement in terms of achieving the objectives, and the objectives, of course, being informed by the Common European Framework. Got to keep my eye on the clock there. Also, precision as something that people tend to look at in terms of language, because clearly if no one can understand you and you're not accurate in your representation of the language, that's of high concern, and that's also another aspect. So in looking at more traditional aspects of the productive criteria and building that into the rubric that we were using for the evaluation of the productive criteria, achievement would be something that you would all be familiar with in terms of communicability and in terms of meeting the can-dos, so those being the objectives of learning. And then the precision, the accuracy. But then there was another piece which we were also looking at, and which we needed to try and operationalize in a way that it would be something that we could assess in terms of student performance. And that was critical engagement. How are students engaging in the process? How are students becoming involved and taking the responsibility that all of us as educators want students to take for their own learning? How are we somehow empowering them to take this information that they were learning and apply it in a meaningful, significant way? We had quite a bit of back and forth in terms of how we were going to look at the weighting in the calibrations of the different components. And here on this chart, you can see specifically, as I mentioned, in terms of the productive skills and incorporating an understanding of the companion volume of 2018 of the Common European Framework. You can see how we broke down the percentages of student evaluation, and of course, understanding the sequencing of the developmental process, how students over time tend to have more knowledge and more information about the language and become more precise in their use of the language, therefore requiring a modification or a shift in terms of the weighting of the different elements. Okay, so what were some of the things that emerged during this process, which is still ongoing? As I mentioned, it's been 2 years, but of course, we're still involved in the becoming or the changing of our curriculum in this process, as in fact, assessment informs us. We always need to be checking in with how things are going and what we need to adjust and how we need to improve to be able to provide, a high quality education experience for our students. So one of the things that emerged from this process that we had to make a decision about was, as I mentioned, broadening the discourse about assessment from, sort of like the classic dichotomy of what is formative versus what is summative, to keeping a focus on process, keeping the idea that all assessment of some sort is formative because it's aligned with learning and therefore holds the potential for meaningful washback, which is an outcome that we were looking for. Clearly, anytime one introduces any type of change into the system, this produces some level of resistance, some difficulties in adapting and adopting what those changes are, because it has to be institution-wide. So rather than making it sort of like a straitjacket where everyone really felt that they were sort of being forced into this change, what we did was we also engaged the teachers in the development of the curriculum and in terms of understanding how we were going to be making this curricular renovation, implementing it, and that everyone would be taking ownership of it together. So it became necessary, obviously, to embrace some of the difficulties that we encountered along the way in the process and the limitations of authentic evaluation in terms of presenting a model for assessment. And as it says here, within the critical literacies framework. And then coming to an understanding, which is oftentimes a little bit difficult. People who have worked in more traditional models of language teaching sort of use use the concepts of the communicative approach and the Common European Framework as sort of their religious text where there can be no deviation. But we had to really underscore the idea that the communicative approach is broad and flexible, and which informs the methodology under construction, because the methodology is always a component that's derived based on the considerations and the theoretical foundations of the individuals involved in producing the curriculum. And also coming to an understanding that the Common European Framework is one particular set of objectives which need to be adapted to the needs and realities of the specific institution and, of course, the local context. So contextualization is obviously a very important part of developing a new curriculum. Recapping this project a little bit, because I'm keeping my eye on the time like I'm supposed to do. As I mentioned, this process was a curricular renovation. We were moving toward a model of language teaching and learning which was aligned with current and future orientations of language as well as education, in this particular case, the socio-critical orientation. And then we were looking to align the language curriculum, pedagogy, and evaluation, the three components under the framework of the curriculum frame, under the auspices of a methodology that portends a more relevant and meaningful learning experience for students. Some of the conclusions that we arrived at during this process were related to institutional transformation. Obviously, the institution at large needs to be behind this process of renovation, and indeed, our university is. But that also requires rethinking the role of the teacher and the leadership team in light of the changing needs of the students, both current and future. So how do we relate to each other? Are we looking for a model that's more top-down, or are we in fact working to co-construct the reality that we're going to be presenting and then sharing with our students? And also, if we're looking to have students become responsible for their own learning and involved in the process, to what extent can students then become involved of the direction we take with the individual curricula? Okay. And challenge of the academic team. Obviously, it's difficult to accept change in any form, but to begin to recognize and possibly even embrace change as inevitable and necessary to stay innovative and forward-thinking, which is what all institutions are attempting to do. And then, of course, how do we, here's sort of the balancing act. How do we hold on to the tradition of assessment, understanding what its objectives are and what we're attempting to achieve with assessment, but at the same time reconceptualize it to discover something that's a little bit more organic and natural and that's evolving in the process, that allows for some type of built-in feedback that allows for multiple ways to demonstrate competence rather than a static, restricted, one-size-fits-all product. So these were some of the issues that we were tackling, and of course, some of the things that we identified as part of the process for curricular renovation, and which clearly affect the notion of how we then assess the new curriculum. That, I believe, is just about time, and we would like to thank you. These are our contact emails, and what I will be doing now is going back to Ines and stopping the image here. In the event that you have any comments or questions, or you would like a little bit more information about any of the aspects that I've shared with you here today, if something was unclear or there was something that you would like us to elaborate on a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So interesting. So let's see, we have questions from the audience. Okay, so we have a comment from Erika Rico, and she says, indeed, it was scary, but a rewarding process. Nice. Still learning. What I love the most about it is that it gives the opportunity to the students to think and act, not just learning in the old way we used to learn languages. Yes, thank you. Nice.
And so
Okay.
Erika is a teacher with us in Idiomas EAFIT, I should mention, one of our excellent teachers. As I mentioned very briefly during the presentation, one of the things that came up when I first arrived at Idiomas and also as part of the process was the understanding that the teachers, to a certain extent, were feeling somewhat alienated from the process. So the curriculum and the work plans and the syllabi and everything were sort of constructed and then delivered under our older framework, which I have to say is not atypical in a lot of language programs. But because we wanted to make this a truly participatory approach, it was necessary and important to all of us, and I think to our teachers, to include them in this reconstruction process. And so a lot of the work that's been done has been a collaborative process, not a top-down or hierarchical so much as it is really focusing on a critical pedagogy and critical literacies framework and working collaboratively to co-construct the curricular model.
Nice, thank you. So that is what you mean when you when you mention that there's a change in the role of the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly.
Nice. Okay, so there was one thing, okay, is that caught my attention, is that you mentioned that at EAFIT you wanted to move from the communicative approach to the transforming lives. I don't know if maybe you could expand a little bit of that. That really got my eye.
So let me take a step back and clarify a little bit in case I misrepresented. So one of the things that occurred originally was a problem with nomenclature. So clearly, when you have a method that's referred to as approach, it begins to confuse a lot of people. So the obvious question is, well, is a participatory approach replacing a communicative approach? And so we had to keep sort of reiterating the concept that, the name participatory approach is a name of a method similar to other methods that simply incorporate the name approach. So natural approach, whole language approach, they're all methods. So is participatory approach. So we haven't gone away from a communicative approach.
Okay.
We're sort of working under that umbrella, but we have a very specific way of thinking about how we deliver the curriculum to and with students and how we develop that in terms of the curriculum itself and the presentation of the curriculum. So in other words, it's not a purely static, by the book, start at page 1 and end at page 50. It's much more interactive with our students, and in fact, it can take different directions. The trick, of course, in the assessment piece is to guarantee that at the end of the day, whatever's happening in the class, the teachers are the ones who are sort of maintaining the structure and the focus, that you have to be meeting your language learning objectives.
Wow, that sounds like a challenge. Like you have different paths and you're still like responsible for everything. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think these are the questions. Is there anything that you would like to add that maybe you left out?
No, I would. Well, sure. Why not? We have a couple more minutes.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
we got a question. Do you want to? Okay.
Please.
So we have a question from Magda Rodriguez. Has teacher development been a continuous process after introducing the changes? And how are the new teachers involved in the whole process?
So the answer to that is yes, but. So yes, obviously, the training has been ongoing and continuous as much as has been possible. And we also learned very early in the process that it wasn't enough to say, okay, you've gotten some training to understand how the process works, and okay, now you're on your own. Good luck with that. God bless. Clearly, because it's a process that requires this ongoing interaction, to the extent possible, we've been doing follow-ups. We've been introducing new aspects. At one point when we really needed to finish the curriculum because, as I mentioned, we have 8 different languages and a variety of populations that we serve. And so this particular method has been introduced across the entire curriculum and the entire panorama of the different languages and populations that we offer, with the exception of children, niños. And actually, we've embarked on a conversation about how we might be able to renovate that curriculum, and we're at that stage now. But going back to the question, in terms of the ongoing teacher development, why did I add the but? The but, obviously, is something that everyone is very well aware of, which is COVID-19. So when the pandemia hit, and when the university closed its doors and we just moved automatically online, the learning curve of everyone to adapt to delivering 100% online, the curriculum that they were still adapting to, created sort of like a slowdown in the developmental process in terms of how we were interacting with each other on an ongoing basis, and how teachers were sort of able to work on their critical literacies and their participatory approach learning curve, because now they had to turn all of their attentions to working with technology, which we hadn't been, obviously we had been introducing normal educational technology within the classroom, but to just sort of move to this distant or distal delivery system, they had to try and sort of work out in their minds how to deliver. The university uses Microsoft Teams, not only to learn how to maneuver that, but also to integrate additional things which would help to model the types of interactions which they had with their students, as well as the different aspects of, teacher management and allowing for group work and different types of activities. So we've taken sort of like a turn or a detour in the natural progression of the introduction of the new method to have to incorporate how to understand how to deliver that through technology. And of course, now with partial returns to campuses, now it's a question of how to have this dual awareness. I have people in front of me, but I also have people connected online, and I have to serve them as if it's one delivery of one method at the same time. And it's been a challenge, I think, for everyone, and we understand that. I hope I answered your question, Magda.
Great. So thank you, Nat. So maybe can I ask a quick question? It is, so what does this teacher involvement look like? So I like try to think about it. You're talking about a collaborative approach, like they're working together. So do you have meetings, or how do you work around this?
So it began with a small group of teachers that we worked with in terms of presenting some of the initial workshops on what is the participatory approach and what type of assessment aligns itself with participatory approach. So the conversation about assessment was actually part of the initial introduction to the new method. This first group of teachers, we sort of gave them some training on curricular design and charged them with the task of creating the new curriculum with, of course, involvement and supervision from their coordinators. So from the very beginning, they were designing the curriculum, and we were involved with them, periodically to sort of like review, give feedback. For me, I've always said in that type of design process, I would rather you didn't sort of give me a finished product. I'd rather you sort of invite me in different stages of the process, because it's a very creative process of creating a whole new curriculum and trying to align it to the language learning objectives at the same time. And of course, not everyone feels very confident in that work. And so it's a very hands-on process in terms of the designs the teachers were creating and our involvement with them to sort of give them feedback and say, yes, you're going in the right direction. How can you push this a little bit further in terms of making sure that student voice and student choice are included in the learning process? And then, of course, for the assessment piece, how do you guarantee that students have a voice in deciding what the actual performance will look like, while at the same time ensuring that they're going to be able to demonstrate their achievement of the language learning objectives that you posed at the beginning of the unit. So it's
Nice. Yes, nice. I really got a mental image. So thank you so much. And now we got one question. Maybe we take 1 minute.
sure.
And so Silvia Diaz Fragoso asks, what was the most difficult task in this innovation? Oh,
I would love to say everything.
okay. Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, just making the choice to completely convert the curriculum obviously is very difficult in itself. And it involves commitment at all levels, from the vicerrectoría to the dirección, you know, all the way down and all the way through. Everyone has to sort of commit and understand what this task involves and what it requires. And of course, you can't expect results in a week, a day, a month. But I would say the most difficult component was not the task itself. It's the, I always sort of frame it in terms of language planning, and I think about models of language planning where people talk about the corpus planning and the status planning, right? So the corpus planning, as long as you have some creativity and some basic guidelines, you can do really well, and you can get down all of the concrete nuts and bolts and construct what it is that you intend to go forward with. It's the status planning, getting the buy-in of everyone involved. And looking back to Freire's concepts and talking about what the banking model of education is, this is the way most of us have been educated most of our lives. We're more accustomed to a receptive model where the teacher is the one who knows everything and we just rely on the teacher to tell us, and we don't really expect to do anything. And of course, some of us are more involved in the learning process, some of us less involved. And this goes through all levels, including teachers, including coordinators, sometimes including the jefe académico. You know, it's the ability to sort of give yourself over to the process and say, I'm going to listen to other people and their ideas so that we can try and incorporate what it is we're doing and work together. And of course, understand that other people will be resistant. Students will not automatically and immediately say, oh, sure, I love this, let's jump ahead and move with it. You have to get student buy-in, teacher buy-in at every level, and that's a little bit more difficult because it's not as tangible as the physical written curriculum.
Nice. Wow, awesome. Yes, thank you. You're right. And then like this thinking, and it takes the time that you're talking about. So, well, thank you very much, Lawrence. Very interesting.
All right, thank you all.